The person you think you are isn't real. That personality you've carefully cultivated, those quirks you think make you unique, those patterns of behavior you've convinced yourself are just who you are. What if I told you they're not personality traits at all? What if they're survival strategies? What if the you that you present to the world, the you that you've built your entire identity around, is actually just a collection of coping mechanisms designed to keep you safe from experiences you couldn't handle when you were too young to handle them? Right now, you're probably thinking about someone you know who fits this description, someone whose personality suddenly makes sense when you understand their childhood, someone whose quirks aren't actually quirks, they're scars. But here's what's going to shake you to your core. You're thinking about yourself. You just don't see it yet. That need to be perfect all the time. That's not high standards. That's the traumatized child who learned that mistakes meant rejection, criticism, or abandonment, that inability to trust people. That's not wisdom or discernment. That's the wounded part of you that learned early that people leave, people lie, people hurt the ones they claim to love. That compulsive need to make everyone laugh, that's not natural charisma. That's the scared kid who discovered that being entertaining meant being valued, and being valued meant being safe. That tendency to disappear when things get difficult, that's not introversion. That's the adaptation of someone who learned that conflict meant danger, that standing up for yourself meant losing love, that it was safer to shrink than to be seen. Every personality disorder in the DSM-5 is trauma wearing a mask. But here's what they don't tell you. Most personality traits that we consider normal are also trauma wearing a mask. The difference between personality disorder and personality isn't the presence or absence of trauma responses. It's the degree to which those trauma responses interfere with daily functioning, but we all have them. These protective adaptations, these survival strategies that once kept us alive but now keep us limited. These masks we learned to wear so early that we forgot they were masks at all. And here's the most beautiful and honestly terrifying truth. Once you see the mask, you can never unsee it. Once you understand that your personality is trauma-based adaptation, everything changes. Your entire sense of self becomes negotiable, your limitations become optional, your character flaws become understandable wounds that can finally heal. But first, let me tell you about someone who discovered her mask in the most unexpected way. Emma was the therapist everyone wanted to see. Warm, empathetic, endlessly patient. She had a gift for making people feel heard, understood, completely accepted. Her practice was full, her clients loved her, and her colleagues respected her emotional intelligence. Emma was also, honestly, slowly dying inside. For 15 years, she'd poured herself into other people's healing while her own wounds remained untouched. She was the friend everyone called during a crisis, but who never had crises of her own, not because she didn't have problems, but because she'd learned so early to be the one who solves problems rather than the one who has them. At 38, Emma couldn't remember the last time she'd said no to anyone. She couldn't remember the last time she'd expressed anger, set a boundary, or asked for help. She couldn't remember the last time she'd been anything other than endlessly giving, endlessly understanding, endlessly available. Everyone saw her as naturally compassionate. Emma saw herself as naturally compassionate, but the truth was much more complex. The breakthrough came during her own therapy session, something she'd finally started after years of burnout she couldn't explain. Her therapist asked a simple question that cracked everything open. Emma, when did you first learn that your worth depended on taking care of other people? The question hit like a physical blow because suddenly Emma could see it. Age 7, watching her mother cry after another fight with her father, little Emma bringing tissues, making jokes, doing anything to make Mum smile again. You're such a good girl, Emma. You're my little helper. I don't know what I'd do without you. And in that moment, 7-year-old Emma made a decision that would shape the next 30 years of her life. Being needed meant being loved. Taking care of others meant being valuable. Other people's emotions were her responsibility. What everyone called her natural empathy was actually a trauma response. Her ability to read emotional rooms, to know exactly what people needed, to anticipate problems before they happened, these weren't gifts. They were survival skills developed by a child who learned that everyone else's emotional stability was the key to her own safety. As Emma began to see her people-pleasing for what it really was, a protective adaptation rather than a personality trait, something terrifying and, well, liberating happened. She realized she had no idea who she actually was underneath the mask. For decades, she'd been so focused on being what others needed that she'd never discovered what she wanted. She'd been so skilled at reading other people's emotions that she'd become illiterate about her own. She'd been so practiced at meeting everyone else's needs that she'd forgotten she had needs too. The unmasking wasn't pretty. Emma went through what felt like an identity crisis as she realized that most of what she thought was her personality was actually complex PTSD masquerading as character traits. Her endless patience, learned helplessness from a childhood where expressing frustration meant being abandoned, her ability to read people, hypervigilance from growing up in an emotionally unpredictable household, her selfless giving, a desperate attempt to earn love by being indispensable. But here's what Emma discovered as she slowly, carefully began removing the mask. Underneath the trauma responses was someone extraordinary, someone she'd never met but had always been. As Emma learned to set boundaries, she discovered she was naturally creative in ways she'd never explored because she'd been too busy managing everyone else's needs. As she learned to express anger healthily, she found she had passionate opinions about things that mattered to her, opinions she'd been suppressing for decades. As she learned to receive care instead of just giving it, she discovered a capacity for joy and spontaneity that had been buried under layers of caretaking compulsion. The real Emma wasn't the endlessly giving therapist that was the mask. The real Emma was someone far more complex, far more interesting, far more alive than the trauma-adapted version everyone thought they knew. And here's what's profound. Emma didn't lose her ability to help people. She became a better therapist, not despite removing her mask, but because of it. When she stopped compulsively caretaking from wound, she could choose to care from wholeness. When she stopped automatically reading rooms from hypervigilance, she could consciously attune from presence. Emma discovered what trauma researchers are proving in laboratories around the world. Healing your trauma doesn't diminish your gifts, it reveals them. But Emma's story raises the most important question of all. If our personalities are really trauma-wearing masks, what does that mean for authenticity, for growth, for the entire way we understand human nature? Let's dive into the science of personality formation, because what you're about to learn will completely change how you see yourself and everyone around you. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk's groundbreaking research on trauma reveals something profound. The human brain is designed to adapt to its environment, especially during critical developmental periods, and adaptation to traumatic environments creates what look like personality traits but are actually survival strategies. When a child grows up in an environment where they need to be hypervigilant to stay safe, their brain literally rewires itself to be constantly scanning for threats. As an adult, this shows up as what we might call anxiety or overthinking, but it's actually a highly sophisticated early warning system that once kept them alive. When a child learns that expressing emotions leads to punishment or abandonment, their brain creates neural pathways that suppress emotional expression. As an adult, this looks like emotional intelligence or being level-headed, but it's actually emotional numbing that once protected them from overwhelming pain. Dr. Gabor Mate puts it this way: the question isn't why the addiction, but why the pain. The question isn't why the mental illness, but why the adaptation. Dr. John Bowlby's research on attachment shows that children develop specific strategies for maintaining connection with their caregivers based on how those caregivers respond to their needs. Secure attachment, roughly half of the population, creates what we call healthy personality traits, like the ability to regulate emotions, form stable relationships, and maintain self-worth. But the other half develop insecure attachment patterns that show up as personality traits throughout their lives. Anxious attachment creates adults who are highly sensitive to social cues, prone to people-pleasing, and terrified of abandonment. We call them empathetic or caring, but they're actually operating from a deep fear of being left alone. Avoidant attachment creates adults who seem independent, emotionally stable, and self-reliant. We call them strong or low maintenance, but they're actually protecting themselves from the vulnerability that once felt dangerous. Disorganized attachment creates adults with inconsistent patterns, sometimes anxious, sometimes avoidant, often struggling with emotional regulation. We call them complicated or unpredictable, but they're actually carrying the nervous system patterns of childhood chaos. Dr. Judith Herman's research on complex PTSD reveals that, well, most personality patterns we consider normal are actually adaptations to what she calls prolonged, repeated trauma. Not the dramatic, obvious trauma we think of when we hear the word. It's really the subtle, everyday trauma of emotional neglect, inconsistent caregiving, family dysfunction, social rejection, or simply growing up in a world that didn't see, understand, or value who you actually were. These aren't character flaws or personality disorders. They're, in fact, intelligent adaptations to environments that couldn't support authentic development. Dr. Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory shows that what we call personality is often just nervous system patterns formed in response to early experiences of safety or threat. Most people spend their entire lives, cycling between fight or flight and freeze or collapse, never experiencing the social engagement state where their authentic self could actually emerge. What you call your personality might just be your nervous system's habitual response to a world that once felt unsafe. So, Buddhist psychology identified this pattern 2,500 years ago. They understood that what we call ego or self is actually a collection of defensive strategies designed to protect against suffering. The Buddha taught that attachment, clinging to ways of being that once served us, is the root of suffering. Not attachment to external things, but attachment to ways of being that have become automatic, unconscious, and limiting. Carl Jung called these patterns personas, masks we wear that eventually become so familiar we forget they're masks. He understood that individuation, becoming who you actually are, requires consciously removing the layers of adaptive responses that once protected you but now limit you. The Stoics practiced a form of personality deconstruction, constantly questioning whether their automatic responses were based on wisdom or conditioning, choice or compulsion, authentic preference or protective adaptation. Here's what trauma-informed psychology reveals about common personality patterns. The perfectionist usually carries childhood experiences of conditional love, where acceptance depended on performance. Their so-called high standards are actually terror of the criticism or rejection they once experienced for making mistakes. The people pleaser often developed in families where they learn to manage other people's emotions to maintain safety. Their kindness is actually hypervigilance about social dynamics and compulsive caretaking. The achiever frequently learned early that external success was the only reliable source of value and attention. Their ambition is actually an addiction to achievement that temporarily quiets deep feelings of inadequacy. The rebel usually formed in environments that were overly controlling or invalidating. Their independence is actually a defensive stance against anyone who might try to control them again. The chameleon typically learned that their authentic self wasn't acceptable, so they became expert at being whatever others wanted them to be. Their adaptability is actually identity confusion and profound disconnection from their authentic preferences. These aren't judgments, these are adaptations, intelligent responses to environments that couldn't support authentic development. But here's what's revolutionary. Once you see the adaptation, you can choose whether to keep it. Let me show you the difference between living from trauma-adapted personality versus living from authentic essence. You wake up each morning and put on your personality like clothes. The perfectionist checks their to-do list and immediately feels behind. The people-pleaser scans their messages to see who needs something. The achiever plans how to be productive. The rebel decides what to resist today. But none of these responses are conscious choices. They're automatic programs running in the background of your consciousness, so familiar you don't even notice them anymore. Your conversations aren't authentic exchanges, they're performances of who you think you need to be to stay safe, loved, valued. You say what you think will get the response you need, not what you actually think or feel. Your decisions aren't based on what you actually want, they're based on what your adaptive strategies think will protect you from re-experiencing old pain. You choose careers that feel safe rather than fulfilling. You choose relationships that feel familiar rather than nourishing. You choose behaviors that minimize risk rather than maximize aliveness. Your emotions aren't allowed to be what they are. They're constantly managed, suppressed, or performed based on what your trauma history taught you was acceptable. You've become so skilled at emotional management that you've lost touch with what you actually feel underneath the management. Most painfully, you've become addicted to the very patterns that limit you because they feel like you. The anxiety feels familiar, so it must be authentic. The people-pleasing feels natural, so it must be your true nature. The emotional numbness feels normal, so it must be who you are. You're living as a ghost of who you could be, wearing the costume of who you had to become to survive. Now, imagine waking up without immediately putting on your personality costume, without automatically checking whether you're being productive enough, likable enough, safe enough, successful enough. Instead, you simply ask, what wants to emerge through me today? Not what you should want, not what would be strategically smart, not what would maintain your image or keep you safe. What actually wants to emerge from your deepest, authentic self? Maybe today your essence wants to create something, maybe it wants to rest, maybe it wants to have a difficult conversation you've been avoiding, maybe it wants to play, to explore, to be spontaneous in ways your adapted personality would never allow. You make decisions based on authentic preference rather than protective strategy. You choose work that aligns with your actual interests and values, not just what feels safe or impressive. You enter relationships with people who see and appreciate your real self, not people who reward your performance. Your emotions become information instead of problems to manage. Anger tells you about violated boundaries. Sadness tells you about unmet needs or losses that require grieving. Fear tells you about things that matter to you. Joy tells you about experiences that align with your authentic nature. You stop being afraid of your emotions because you understand they're not threats to your constructed identity. They're messages from your authentic self. Living from mask requires enormous energy because, well, you're constantly monitoring, adjusting, performing. You're splitting your attention between actually experiencing life and managing how your experience appears to others. Living from essence, though, is effortless because you're not maintaining a performance. You're simply being what you are, expressing what wants to be expressed, following what genuinely calls to you. People living from mask are exhausted by social interactions because they're constantly calculating, adapting, performing. On the other hand, people living from essence are energized by authentic connection because they're not working so hard to be anything other than themselves. When you stop performing your trauma-adapted personality, your relationships transform completely. Instead of attracting people who are drawn to your mask and who often trigger your original wounds, you start attracting people who resonate with your essence. Instead of relationships based on mutual enabling of each other's protective patterns, you develop relationships based on mutual recognition of each other's authentic nature. Instead of love that depends on maintaining a performance, you experience love that celebrates your real self, including the messy, imperfect, still healing parts. But here's what's challenging. When you start removing your mask, some people in your life won't like it, because they've become attached to the version of you that serves their needs, manages their emotions, or fits their expectations. This is absolutely terrifying for people living from mask, but for people living from essence, it's clarifying. It shows you who loved your performance versus who loves your authenticity. So, how do you begin the process of seeing through your own masks? How do you distinguish between authentic personality and trauma adaptation? And, well, how do you reclaim your essence without losing everything you've built on the foundation of your adapted self? Let me give you the framework for conscious unmasking. H stands for honest pattern recognition. The first step isn't changing anything, it's simply seeing what's actually there. For the next week, just become a curious observer of your automatic patterns. When do you automatically say yes, even though deep down you want to say no? When do you find yourself performing emotions you don't actually feel? And, When do you make choices based on what you think you should want rather than what you actually want? Keep a simple journal with 3 columns. What happened? The external situation, what you automatically did, said, or felt, and what you actually wanted to do, say, or feel. Don't judge the gaps between your automatic response and your authentic desire. Just notice them. Most people, honestly, are shocked to discover how often they're performing a version of themselves rather than simply being themselves. Here are some specific patterns to watch for. Automatic caretaking when others are upset, immediate perfectionism when starting new tasks, instant performance mode in social situations, reflexively minimizing your own needs or problems, compulsive productivity or achievement seeking, and automatic withdrawal when conflict arises. So, once you've identified patterns, it's important to, gently investigate their origins. Not so much to blame yourself or analyze endlessly, but really to understand the intelligence behind your adaptations. You might ask yourself, when did I first learn this pattern? What was happening in my life when this strategy developed? What was this adaptation trying to protect me from? More often than not, you'll discover that your most limiting personality traits were, at one time, your most brilliant survival strategies. For example, the perfectionism that now creates anxiety, it once protected you from criticism. The people-pleasing that now leaves you feeling exhausted once ensured you were valued. And the emotional withdrawal that now isolates you, that once kept you safe from overwhelming feelings. And understanding the origin doesn't mean you're stuck with the pattern. It just means you can appreciate its intelligence while also choosing whether it still serves you. This is honestly the most delicate part of the process, learning to hold compassion for your adaptations, while at the same time creating space for your essence to emerge. You might want to practice saying, "This pattern once kept me safe, and I'm grateful for its protection. And now I'm safe enough to try something different." It's really important not to try to rip off your masks violently. Trauma-adapted patterns exist for good reasons, and forcing change often just creates more trauma. Instead, focus on creating internal safety first, and then let new possibilities emerge gradually. Now start conducting small experiments in authenticity. Not, dramatic life overhauls, but tiny tests of expressing your real preferences and boundaries. Try saying, "I don't know," when you actually don't know, instead of pretending you do. Try expressing minor irritation instead of just automatically smoothing it over. Try asking for something you need rather than hoping someone will guess. Start with low-stakes situations where the consequences of authenticity are, minimal. Build your tolerance for being real gradually. There's something called the morning essence check. Before you check your phone, before you start your productivity routine, before you put on your personality costume for the day, just ask yourself, what does my authentic self want to experience today? Not what you should want, but what genuinely calls to you. Then there's the boundary experiment practice, saying no to small requests that don't align with your authentic desires. Notice what comes up. Maybe guilt, maybe fear, or stories about being selfish or ungrateful. These reactions reveal just how deep your adaptive programming goes. Next, the emotion archaeology. When strong emotions arise, instead of immediately managing them, ask, how old does this feeling feel? What does this part of me need to feel safe? Often current emotional reactions are actually old feelings that never got to be fully experienced and integrated. And then the preference investigation. Make a list of your preferences in everything: food, music, colors, activities, social situations. Then ask, are these actually my preferences, or are they what I learned was safe, acceptable, or impressive to prefer? Many people discover they don't actually know what they like because they've been so focused on liking what they thought they should like. Look at your closest relationships and ask yourself, do these people know and appreciate my authentic self? Or are they attached to my adaptive self? Do I feel safe to be real with them, or do I automatically perform? Do they support my growth and healing, or do they need me to stay the same so they can feel comfortable? This isn't about judging your relationships, but about understanding which relationships support authenticity and which ones require performance. The goal isn't to completely eliminate your adaptive patterns. Some of them may actually serve you well in certain contexts. The real goal is to make them conscious choices rather than unconscious compulsions. Emma didn't stop being empathetic when she healed her people-pleasing. She learned to choose when to be empathetic rather than being compulsively empathetic. She developed what psychologists call flexible responding, the ability to access different parts of herself, depending on what the situation genuinely called for. So here we are at the intersection of everything you thought you knew about yourself and everything you're beginning to discover about who you actually are. And maybe you're feeling a mix of terror and excitement. Terror, because recognizing your personality as trauma-adapted means questioning everything you thought was fixed about yourself. Excitement, because it means everything you thought was fixed about yourself is actually negotiable. We live in a culture that treats personality as destiny. That tells you to be yourself without ever questioning whether the self you're being is actually yourself or just a collection of survival strategies you learned before you were old enough to know you were learning them. But personality isn't destiny. Personality is possibility. Personality is potential. Personality is the raw material of who you could become when you're no longer limited by who you had to be to survive. When you see through the mask, you don't lose yourself. You find yourself, the self that was always there underneath the adaptations, waiting patiently for the safety and space to emerge. Understanding that personality is trauma wearing a mask doesn't just change how you see yourself. It changes how you see everyone. That difficult person in your life, their behavior suddenly makes sense when you understand it as protective adaptation rather than intentional cruelty. That family member who's impossible to please, their criticism isn't about you, it's about the wounded part of them that learned early that nothing was ever good enough. That friend who's always dramatic, their intensity isn't attention-seeking, it's the adaptation of someone who learned that big emotions were the only way to get their needs met. When you see masks instead of people, judgment transforms into compassion, frustration transforms into understanding, conflict transforms into an opportunity for mutual healing. Here's what's beautiful about this understanding. When you stop believing your personality is fixed, you become free to be authentic in ways you never imagined possible. Authenticity isn't about expressing every thought and feeling. It's about expressing your thoughts and feelings from essence, rather than from adaptive strategy. Authenticity isn't about rejecting all social conditioning. It's about choosing which conditioning serves your authentic development and which conditioning limits it. Authenticity isn't about becoming someone completely different. It's about becoming more fully who you've always been underneath the protective layers. And here's the most profound part. As you heal your trauma and remove your masks, you don't lose the gifts that came from your adaptations. You integrate them consciously. Emma's empathy became even more powerful when it came from choice rather than compulsion. Her ability to read emotional dynamics became a professional asset when it wasn't driven by hypervigilance. Her caring for others became genuinely nourishing when it wasn't motivated by the fear of abandonment. Your adaptations contain wisdom. Your survival strategies contain skills. Your trauma responses contain intelligence. The goal isn't to eliminate them, but to free them from the prison of unconscious compulsion. So, who are you when you're not your trauma-adapted personality? You're not the anxious overthinker, your consciousness experiencing anxiety and overthinking as temporary weather patterns. You're not the people pleaser. You're someone who chooses when to give and when to receive based on authentic generosity rather than compulsive caretaking. You're not the perfectionist. You're someone who chooses excellence when it serves you and accepts imperfection when it doesn't. You're not the achiever. You're someone who creates and builds from passion rather than from the desperate need to prove worth. You are not your personality. You are the awareness in which personality arises and dissolves. You are the space in which all patterns come and go. You are the essence that exists before adaptation, during adaptation, and after healing. Your personality is trauma wearing a mask. But that's not a tragedy. It's the best news you could possibly receive. Because it means you're not stuck. It means you're not limited by just who you are. It means every pattern that feels fixed and unchangeable is actually fluid and workable. It means you can heal, you can grow, you can become. Not by forcing yourself to be different, but by creating the safety and space for your authentic essence to emerge naturally. Not by rejecting your adaptations, but by appreciating their intelligence while freeing them from unconscious compulsion. Not by becoming someone else, but by becoming more fully who you've always been underneath the protective layers. Your trauma gave you masks to wear when you couldn't yet be yourself safely. Those masks protected you, helped you survive, got you through experiences that would have been overwhelming for your developing nervous system, but you're not developing anymore. You're developed. You're not a child who needs protection from authenticity. You're an adult who can finally handle being real. The masks that once protected you may now be limiting you. The adaptations that once kept you safe may now be keeping you small. The personality that once ensured survival may now be preventing you from truly living. But underneath it all, underneath every defensive pattern, every protective strategy, every trauma-adapted trait, there's something indestructible, something pure, something that was never wounded, because it was never separate from the wholeness that it came from. Call it essence, call it authentic self, call it consciousness, call it soul. It's been waiting patiently underneath your masks, ready to emerge the moment you create the safety and space for it to be seen. Your personality is trauma wearing a mask, but you are the one who can choose to remove it. And when you do, when you finally let your essence emerge after years or decades of protective adaptation, you'll discover something extraordinary. You are not who you think you are. You're so much more beautiful, creative, powerful, and alive than any mask could ever contain. The performance is over. The real show is about to begin. Who you actually are has been waiting long enough. It's time to let them finally come home.